So, essentially, we're going to be talking in this session about the subject of the Big Bang. No, we're not going to be talking about the comedy show. We're going to be talking about the scientific theory, the Big Bang. Many scientists have essentially argued in our current day and age that modern cosmology, by the way, cosmos is the Greek word for universe, that modern cosmology has rendered God's existence obsolete. We don't need a God. We have a Big Bang. But does the Big Bang truly hold up under careful scrutiny? Well, I'm going to essentially be asserting in this session that as we study the issues out, the Big Bang theory becomes logically impossible. Logically impossible in the same way that a square circle would be logically impossible, or a married bachelor would be logically impossible. And this is something that creates major problems for strict ideas about naturalism, that is a universe with no God. So let's look at this together here today. And we'll begin with the current state of science in our modern world. So looking right to your session guides, in a September 2014 issue of Scientific American, renowned physicist and cosmologist George Ellis wrote the following, quote, "Many of the possible high-energy physics experiments and astronomy observations relevant to cosmology are nearly complete," end quote. What on earth does all of that mean, and who is George Ellis? Well, George Ellis is a leading thinker today in our study of the universe. His heightened expertise has brought him spectacular public attention. His stature as a scientist today is virtually unparalleled, surpassed only by the genius of the now late Stephen Hawking. His most formative work, which would be the large-scale structure of space-time, was jointly authored with the deceased legend and is now considered today to be a classic. And presently, Ellis serves as the Emeritus Distinguished Professor of Complex Systems at the University of Cape Town. Well, commenting on the status of modern science, Ellis writes the following, quote, "Astronomical observations are now probing the most distant events that will ever be seeable, that is, through our telescopes." He then proceeds, quote, "I know this kind of thing has been said before, but that was before we'd explored the entire universe at all wavelengths." Very interesting. Continuing, Ellis writes, quote, "We have seen right back to the last scattering surface in the early universe." Concluding, he describes a parallel problem for particle physics, which would be the study of the very small, predicting as he does a, quote, "coming end to all experiment." That is, science has reached a, quote, "end of all experiment." Well, George Ellis's words certainly carry a very ominous ring to them for some people. The notion that science has now reached its limits to some is very eerie and foreboding. Proponents of strict naturalism have long held out hope that science will one day discover a grand unified theory of everything. However, in the recent interview, and this is very interesting, Ellis candidly wrote the following, "It is in my view unlikely that there is a unified theory of everything." He then noted that interest in the concept will likely slowly diminish, adding, quote, "Such a theory may not exist." And so what does such a startling admission mean for modern science today? How do Ellis's comments, how do they affect the broader field of physics? Well, given that experts currently lack the language to fully describe our universe, because of this, cosmology as a project is fundamentally incomplete. And so what this means is that no physical theory can thus currently account for the birth of the cosmos, uniting every primitive force and founding law of nature. Contrarily, there may be no way to describe a self-contained universe which never again resorts to crying out for God's existence. The big question for us this morning is, will Ellis's arguments receive a proper hearing amongst today's scientists? Will naturalism, in particular, learn to shrink back and amend its expectations? Or will modern science simply ignore Ellis's comments, only to turn and accuse the celebrated professor of somehow misjudging the situation? Well, given that atheism currently refuses to admit that a divine creator exists, it is unlikely that many will choose to accept the recent prognosis. Then again, one wonders, what other choice do atheists have? And given the limits of our observations, there may now be no other alternative but to admit that we're never going to get a full picture. Well, recently I was engaging with an atheist on this point. He had accused Christianity of being guilty of sort of farcical reasoning and believing modern physics to be near to achieving its grand ambitions. He criticized Christians who naively see God in nature. He said to me, "You see a gap in science, and then you claim that God did it, only to become ashamed when science discovers the natural explanation. You presume upon reality, but without a formal critical basis. And how is this different from merely assuming the conclusions of your own beliefs?" And so perhaps as you've engaged in your own evangelism, you've run into this kind of thinking before. Well, taking in the argument, I grasp the man's point. Christians will often use God to explain the unexplainable. And so gaps in human knowledge become places to worship God, with many Christians expecting science to routinely encounter such mysteries. Conversely, scientists, and in particular physicists, have often sought the very opposite, expecting science to elicit a more physical explanation. And historically, the latter has, of course, fueled our vast pursuit of natural knowledge, leading to numerous breakthroughs in technology and modern medicine. The question is, can such a pattern of physical discovery continue forever? I think that's the question that we've got to address. That is, will science hurtle forward eternally unabated? Well, today there are several important reasons why Ellis is absolutely right, given our current situation. You see, as a sailor perched in a crow's nest, so the Earth is set in space with a panoramic view which curves and dips beyond our sight range. Such a fundamental problem means that no human being will ever be able to see beyond the Earth's current celestial horizons. In other words, we can only see as far as we can see. Now, the significance of this point is really, truly difficult to overstate. It implies that we have now seen virtually all that is feasibly visible to us. Taken together with Ellis's comments about the current limits of particle physics, that is the science of the very small, and it indeed becomes reasonable to conclude that science is reaching its limits. We've seen as much of the very big as we can see, and we've probably seen as much of the very small as we will ever see. But perhaps the greatest challenge for the state of modern astrophysics lies within the very heart of its own faulty theoretical predictions. Given the severity of these problems, there may now be no way to prevent modern cosmology from imploding its own foundations. And so I therefore sought to clarify the central point at issue here, a pan-popular concept known today as the Big Bang. Well, currently, my atheist friend was thoroughly persuaded that our modern descriptive models have successfully disemployed religion. As leading physicists have argued, the Big Bang theory explains how the universe evolved from absolutely nothing. But whatever problems lie at the heart of this murky concept, the answer is related to the principal theory's initial conditions. So if you ever sat up late in your pre-Christian days getting high on crystal meth and watching Nova, you probably remember the very intriguing accounts of how the universe came to be from absolutely nothing. Of course, the answer to all of this is going to rely, how effective is the Big Bang at predicting what we see? The answer lies at studying the initial conditions of the theory itself. Question?
Isn't like the Big Bang, isn't that like God speaking it into existence? Because it came from nothing.
That's exactly what we're going to be looking at in this session. You see, essentially, this is what we've got to recognize. According to Albert Einstein, that's a familiar name to most of us, He was the progenitor of quantum physics. Our classical views of gravity necessitate a cosmic beginning. Now, without getting caught up into all the technical jargon there, this fact has led many scientists, including George Ellis, to theorize that the universe evolved from a single point. Now, today, this conventional concept has become a core doctrine of science and is appropriately referred to as the singularity theory. However, what most scientists today seem wholly unaware of is that the singularity theory, this idea, really cannot account for cosmic creation. Now, a simple math problem is sufficient to demonstrate the reason why. Namely, what is the solution to infinity minus 1?
Infinity.
Well, incidentally, the answer to the question would be the same if you asked it oppositely. What is the solution to infinity plus 1? You see, in either case, the laws of mathematics have actually determined the outcome. Simply put, infinity plus or minus any natural number is infinity. As it turns out, no other answer for any reason can be accepted. Now, this profound problem here poses a threat to modern cosmology, which would be the theoretical branch of modern astrophysics. The reason why is that our various models of physical origins are based upon the universe's expanding from a point of infinite smallness. But we've just shown that an infinitely small object cannot increase in size even to that of a tiny electron. Such a quandary raises doubts about the Big Bang theory itself, which in turn presents a threat to the viability of modern scientism. Unfortunately, the present point is sometimes lost on laypeople. Atheists in particular are prone to see this objection as somewhat suspicious. Perhaps the singularity is only potentially infinitesimal, rather than representing a sort of literal infinite measure. But such notions really fail to recognize that singularities, by definition, lack a true surveyable geometry. In other words, we could say that singularities simply have no size. This would therefore mean that no physical measurements can be derived from them. About this, well-known cosmologist P.C.W. Davies affirms that a singularity is a point at which all distances have shrunk to zero. In fact, a singularity which is said to have a size would simply be a gross contradiction in terms. The very fact that no finite measures can be derived from such an object is a clear indication that we are dealing with the item in question. As physicist Frank Tipler urges, quote, "At the singularity, space came into existence, literally nothing existed before it." But this is not the only obvious problem with the theory. Other pressing issues trouble the heart of this strange abstraction. Instead, it is the prediction of additional infinite quantities which make the Big Bang, frankly, seem more like science fiction. As astrophysicists J. Richard Gott and James E. Gunn have written, quote, "The universe began from a state of infinite density. An application of previous mathematical principle proves the problem. Infinite density cannot be downwardly adjusted. And neither, for that matter, can infinite heat. Can the singularity, if it is infinitely hot, become cooler? No. And infinite temperature can't cool." Well, sadly, most atheists seem unwilling to admit that this is a problem. They normally attempt to argue that our cosmic models are merely incomplete. Hey, the project's not done yet. Just wait a decade or two. Vowing future discoveries will one day solve these looming issues, they hold that religion will soon be consigned to a place of utter defeat. But such a hopeful forecast fails due to Ellis's recent statement. Quote, "Our ability to test physics on the smallest scales is virtually ended." Anybody ever hear of the God particle, the Hadron Collider? We just can't see any smaller than that machine can see. There's no way to do it. You would need more energy than you could, snatch from the entire Milky Way galaxy to see smaller than that.
Mostly more energy than you can even fathom.
It's just a fathomless level of energy. How do we see smaller than we can see? We just can't. So I hope you all can understand that this is very different from Lord Kelvin's rather naive and strange comment that he made in 1900 that science has basically discovered everything. No, we're not saying that. We're saying that science has discovered all that we can empirically observe. That's a very different kind of a statement. So, essentially, the only real hope of somehow avoiding this sort of puzzling problem is to do away with the cosmic singularity completely. But it's really doubtful, frankly, that this sort of a goal is realistic or realizable. In fact, no scientist has ever proposed a solution. The closest possible candidate would be the famous quantum gravity model, which was jointly conceived and published by scientists Stephen Hawking and James Hartle. Now, this strange proposal seeks to remove the singularity by cleverly leveraging the use of something they call imaginary time. The troubling question is, what could possibly be meant by such a concept? I mean, can anyone even conceive of a form of time that is merely imaginary? Commenting on this point, renowned philosopher of time, Professor William Lane Craig, wrote the following statement, quote, "There is no intelligible physical interpretation of imaginary time on offer. What, for example, would it mean to speak of the lapse of an imaginary second?" And so Craig thus seems to see here considerable grounds for doubt that imaginary time could be construed realistically. He therefore states, quote, "Imaginary time is most plausibly a mathematical contrivance, nothing more." And I think that we can agree this morning that it seems difficult to reasonably disagree with that sort of assessment. Well, by a long shot, really the strongest reason to fault this quantum model comes from the pen of Professor Hawking himself. In his intriguing volume, A Brief History of Time, Hawking admitted to the doubtful nature of his proposal. Only if we imagine the universe with imaginary time, he noted, would there be no singularities. However, he says, when one goes back to the real time in which we live, there will still appear to be singularities. Now, up to this point, my atheist friend had sort of just patiently listened. The argument was so convincing to him that even he reluctantly conceded to the absurdity of the point. The Big Bang proposal, no matter how one describes it, could not have occurred at any time in all of cosmic history. Furthermore, without the Big Bang, there simply is no way to estimate with absolute certainty the age of our expanding universe. Nor is there a way to posit a physical cause to creation. But the loop gets even tighter as we consider our most recent evidence. In 2003, renowned scientific trio Arvin Board, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin proposed a theory. Now called the Board-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, the proposal entitles the previous argument to even further reaching applications. Various predictions at its center suggest that any universe, which exists on average in a state of cosmic expansion like this, cannot be eternal in the past, but must have a beginning at a cosmic singularity a finite time ago. Commenting on the theory in 1994, Board and Vilenkin wrote the following fascinating statement, quote, "A model of the universe in which the expansion has no end naturally leads to this question: can this model avoid the problem of the cosmic singularity at the beginning?" They then comment, quote, "This is in fact not possible in future eternal spacetimes. So long as these models obey some reasonable physical conditions, such models must necessarily possess singularities." Now, can we appreciate the profundity of a point like this? In a sense, what this is saying is that no cosmological model, however grand, can avoid the present point at issue. The problem under review will therefore continue to plague modern cosmology and will potentially forever remain as a thorn in the side of modern scientism. Whether vacuum fluctuation models or chaotic inflationary models, whether oscillating models or even string scenarios, no proposal, including that one, will ever be able to posit a physical or natural cause for the expansion of our universe. This is really a huge, huge problem for modern science. Now, with these points established, we need to now consider objections against it. The first is, how exactly should we grapple with the existence of what is sometimes referred to as black body radiation? These sorts of startling novel predictions, which are classically derived from the Big Bang theory, have convinced most physicists that the Big Bang did indeed historically happen. Listen, if the universe bears evidence of a tremendous explosion, then the explosion must have happened. And of course, those familiar with science history will easily recall the great shock delivered at the discovery of this strange new radiation, which was immediately identified as a relic, a leftover relic of the Big Bang, a sort of leftover glow from the universe's early primordial eruption. The trouble, however, with this sort of a hasty inference is that the cosmic radiation naturally scattered would share in all the same problem origins. For the cosmic microwave background radiation, or CMB for short, is conventionally understood as implying a singularity. Thus, Hawking and Ellis argued some years ago, quote, path-directed closed trapped surfaces exist if the CMB has been partially thermalized by scattering. The CMB itself would thus depend upon the very phenomenon in question. Hence, it would seem that we have circled back to our initial objection. For this reason, discoveries like the CMB do not prove the Big Bang. Unfortunately, this would simply be another way of instead saying that the CMB must be caused naturalistically by a cosmic singularity. As philosopher of science John Earman has noted, quote, a space-time is singular, in other words, it comes to a point, if it contains an inextendable path of finite length. Thus, the last remaining hope for somehow reversing this sort of problem would be the discovery of some serendipitous miscalculation in the heart of the space-time singularity. In other words, maybe we just got the math wrong. Maybe it's not infinite. Maybe it's 2 billion supercalifragilistic, whatever. Yeah. Maybe it's just some really big number that we don't know how to name, and so we just call it infinity. Yeah. At this, it must be frankly stated that the century-long war against the Big Bang proposal would itself be the proof that no such miscalculation exists. As Hawking and Ellis both state, quote, the theorems on the existence of singularities could possibly be refined somewhat, but in our view, they are already adequate. In other words, it's not broke, we don't need to fix it, there's no problem. That's what the math says, that's what it says. Hence, neither of these objections can really rescue the Big Bang. For this reason, I would say that Christian theism, and in fact the book of Genesis, clearly has the higher ground here. No one seems able to avoid the irksome singularity. By extension, this would mean that no physical cause can be shown to give account for the universe's existence and expansion. Indeed, the now dated comments of Sir Arthur Eddington seem all the more appropriate given what we are seeing this morning. Quote, the beginning of the universe seems to present insuperable difficulties unless we agree to look on it as frankly supernatural. And so in conclusion, I think it's important that both believers and skeptics are open to evidence for creation from astrophysics. Deductive inferences can help us to build credible scientific models which can adequately explain our creation. So I'm not saying that we need to behave ourselves as though we're going to be anti-science. That's not the point of this lecture. Rather, modern science, it seriously cannot expect, I think, defenders of biblical creation to be intimidated by these sorts of models of the creation of the universe which are axiomatically defective. In other words, for certain in-principle reasons, it's impossible for them to be real. Rather, Christians are logically justified in rejecting the Big Bang as being a spurious interpretation of the evidence. And so thus in review, I have argued this morning in our first session that cosmic expansion from a singularity is impossible. On the basis of this startling problem, I have introduced a set of 4 critical and illuminating points, and they are the following. Number 1, the Big Bang never historically happened. Number 2, no scientific model can presently repair the problem. Number 3, the Big Bang cannot provide a basis for fixing a precise age of our universe. we can't realistically say that it is indeed unmistakably 13.8 billion years. And 4, only a supernatural cause of the universe is truly possible. There is no natural physical explosion that could do this. Rather, only a supernatural cause is therefore possible, because not even God can increase the size of an infinitely small dot. So that's why God can't use the Big Bang, just to get back to Ms. Michon's question. Now, I do want to say something here, because I have sometimes had students sort of look at me quizzically and say, what do you mean God can't do something that's impossible? You think he can't increase that infinitely small dot? He can do anything he wants. This view is not really largely believed upon by today's theologians. That is, today's theologians do not believe that God can do anything. And in fact, that has historically been the opinion of biblical theologians. God cannot just do anything he wants. He cannot, for example, create a rock so big that he can't lift it. That's a self-contradictory idea. God cannot draw a picture on the board today of a square circle. So ideas such as this, that God can just do anything, these are related to a model of God's power that's sometimes referred to as universal possibilism. Universal possibilism. And universal possibilism essentially says that God can do anything he wants to. But these ideas are not believed by the majority of theologians that have lived, died, and written in church history. Rather, there are certain limitations to what God can do. Let's face it, Mel Gibson can put a picture on a screen of Jesus rising from the dead. He can't put a picture up there of a squared circle. Right? So God can't do the manifestly absurd. He can't do that. And so these unavoidable conclusions, which I presented here, if sound, they really do wholly preclude modern scientism from somehow supplanting biblical creation. They also open up new possibilities for contemplating the biblical and supernatural origins of our space-time universe. So essentially, the question we're going to come back to and address eventually in the second session this morning is, could it be that the universe is younger than 13.8 billion years? If it doesn't need to be 13.8 billion years to get the physical cause to push the galaxies apart, then could it be younger? That's the question that we're going to be looking into in the next session as we explore the distant starlight problem. Okay?